In the mountains of West Virginia, there's a cemetery where the headstones tell a story that defies nature itself. The dates don't make sense. The names repeat in impossible ways. And if you trace the family lines carved into weathered stone, you'll discover something that will make your blood run cold. This isn't just about inbreeding. This isn't just about isolation. This is about a woman who became pregnant by her own grandson and the twisted bloodline that created one of America's most disturbing family secrets. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What I'm about to tell you was buried for over a century. The records were hidden, the witnesses silenced, and the truth locked away in courthouse basements and family Bibles that no one dared to open. But I found it, and once you hear this story, you'll understand why some secrets were meant to stay buried. Her name was Betty, and she lived in the hollow where the sun barely reached the ground, where families had been marrying their cousins for so long that the children were born with faces that looked ancient, eyes that seemed to know things they shouldn't know, and hands that shook with the weight of generations of genetic damage. But Betty's story goes deeper than that, much deeper. The year was 1887, and the mountains of West Virginia were a world unto themselves. No roads led in or out of Cane Creek Hollow. No strangers came calling. The families that lived there had been isolated for nearly a century, and their bloodlines had become so tangled that mapping their family trees was like trying to solve a puzzle where every piece was the wrong shape. Betty was born into this world with a curse already written in her bones. Her parents were first cousins, her grandparents were siblings, and her great-grandparents? Well, the records get murky there because some truths were too dark even for the family Bible. By the time Betty drew her first breath, she was already carrying the genetic burden of 5 generations of inbreeding. But here's what the historians won't tell you. Here's what they buried in those courthouse records. Betty wasn't just a victim of this twisted family tree. She became its architect. As she grew from a girl into a woman, something inside her broke in a way that can't be explained by genetics alone. It was as if the mountains themselves had poisoned her soul, turning her into something that existed outside the boundaries of human decency. The first signs appeared when she was 14. The other children in the hollow would whisper about how Betty's eyes would follow her male relatives in ways that made their skin crawl. How she would stand too close, touch too long, smile in ways that promised things that should never be promised between blood relatives. The old women of the hollow knew what they were seeing, but they also knew that speaking of it would only invite more darkness into their already cursed lives. By the time Betty was 16, she had already given birth to her first child. The father was her uncle. But that was just the beginning of a story that would make even the most hardened investigators question what they thought they knew about the depths of human depravity. The hollow had its own rules, its own twisted logic that made sense only to those who had never known any other way of living. But even by those standards, what happened next defied comprehension. Betty's first child, a boy named Samuel, was born with the telltale signs of severe inbreeding. His eyes were too close together, his skull was misshapen, and his fingers were webbed like some ancient curse made flesh. But Betty looked at that child and saw something else entirely. She saw opportunity. She saw the continuation of a bloodline that had become so concentrated, so pure in its corruption, that it had transcended normal human boundaries. And as Samuel grew from infant to toddler to boy, Betty began to groom him for a role that no child should ever be prepared for. The isolation of the hollow worked in her favor. There were no schools, no churches, no outside authorities to question what was happening behind the walls of that ramshackle cabin. Betty became Samuel's entire world, teaching him that the love between family members knew no boundaries, that what happened in other families was weak and diluted compared to the pure devotion that existed within their own bloodline. By the time Samuel was 12, the other families in the hollow had begun to notice changes in Betty's behavior. She had become possessive of the boy in ways that made even the most hardened mountain folk uncomfortable. She wouldn't let him play with other children. She wouldn't let him work in the fields with the other men. Instead, she kept him close, whispering secrets in his ear that turned his young face pale with understanding. The old-timers remember stories passed down from their grandparents about strange sounds coming from Betty's cabin late at night. Sounds that weren't quite crying and weren't quite singing, but something in between that made the hair on your arms stand up. They remember how Samuel's eyes began to take on the same predatory gleam as his mother's, and how he stopped looking at other people altogether, as if Betty had become the only person in his world who mattered. What happened when Samuel turned 15 is documented in a journal that was discovered in 1962, hidden in the walls of the old cabin during its demolition. The entries were written in Betty's own hand, and they reveal a mind that had descended so far into madness that she believed she was performing some kind of sacred ritual, preserving what she called the pure blood of her lineage. The journal speaks of ceremonies performed under the light of the full moon, where Betty would recite the names of her ancestors and speak of her duty to continue their work. She wrote about how the outside world had been corrupted by mixing bloodlines, how only families like hers understood the true power that came from keeping the blood concentrated and undiluted. But most disturbing of all, she wrote about Samuel as if he weren't her son, but her destiny. The neighbors began to notice that Samuel was changing. His voice had dropped, his shoulders had broadened, but his mind seemed to be regressing. He spoke in fragments, half-sentences that sounded like prayers or incantations. He would walk the boundaries of their property at dawn and dusk, moving in patterns that suggested ritual rather than exercise, and always, Betty was watching him with eyes that burned with a hunger that went beyond maternal affection. The inevitable happened on a winter night in 1904. Samuel was 17 and Betty was 33. The journal entry from that night is written in a shaking hand, but the words are clear enough to make your blood run cold. Betty wrote about completing the circle and achieving the perfection that God intended. She wrote about how Samuel came to her not as a son, but as the culmination of everything their bloodline had been building toward. And 9 months later, Betty gave birth to a daughter who was simultaneously Samuel's child and his sister, Betty's grandchild and her own daughter. The family tree hadn't just been twisted, it had been tied into a knot that defied every law of nature and decency. The child born from this unholy union was named Sarah. From the moment she drew her first breath, it was clear that something fundamental had broken in the genetic code that created her. She was born with features so distorted that even the hardened midwife who delivered her crossed herself and whispered prayers for forgiveness. Her skull was severely malformed. Her limbs were twisted, and her eyes held a vacancy that suggested the soul behind them had been damaged beyond repair. But Betty looked at this broken child and saw triumph. In her warped mind, Sarah represented the ultimate achievement of her bloodline's purity. She had created something that existed nowhere else on earth, a being whose genetic heritage was so concentrated that she embodied generations of accumulated traits in a single twisted form. Betty wrote in her journal that Sarah was the perfect vessel and the key to unlocking the final mystery. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. The Hollow's other families began to avoid Betty's cabin entirely. They would take longer routes to avoid passing by her property, and they forbade their children from playing anywhere near the creek that ran behind her land. The few who caught glimpses of Sarah spoke in whispers about a child who didn't seem quite human, whose cries sounded more like the calls of some wounded animal than the sounds of an infant. Samuel, meanwhile, had become something barely recognizable as the boy he once was. The trauma of what his mother had done to him, combined with the genetic damage he carried, had left him in a state of permanent mental regression. He would spend hours sitting on the cabin's front porch, rocking back and forth while staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling words that might have been names or might have been nonsense. But Betty wasn't finished. As Sarah grew from infant to toddler, Betty began to speak of her plans for the child's future. She talked about how Sarah would eventually give birth to children who would be even more perfect, even more pure. And when people asked who the father would be, Betty's smile would take on that same predatory gleam that had marked the beginning of this nightmare decades earlier. As Sarah reached her 5th birthday, the true horror of Betty's vision began to reveal itself. The child could barely walk. Her speech was incomprehensible, and her behavior alternated between periods of complete catatonia and violent outbursts that required both Betty and Samuel to restrain her. But in Betty's increasingly fractured mind, these weren't signs of genetic catastrophe. They were proof that Sarah had transcended normal human limitations. The journal entries from this period descend into pure madness. Betty wrote about receiving visions from her ancestors about how they appeared to her in dreams and told her that Sarah was the chosen vessel who would give birth to a new kind of human being. She described elaborate rituals she performed over the child, covering her in symbols drawn with ash and blood, whispering incantations in a language that seemed to be part dialect and part something else entirely. The other families in the Hollow had reached their breaking point. Led by the eldest patriarch, a man named Ezekiel, who claimed to have seen enough darkness for several lifetimes, they gathered one autumn evening to discuss what they called the Betty problem. These weren't people who scared easily. They had lived through years of isolation, poverty, and their own genetic nightmares. But what was happening in that cabin by the creek had crossed a line that even they couldn't ignore. The decision they reached that night was as brutal as it was final. They would give Betty one last chance to leave the Hollow voluntarily, taking her broken family with her. If she refused, they would take matters into their own hands. The threat was delivered by Ezekiel himself, who walked to Betty's cabin on a morning when the fog hung so thick you couldn't see your own feet. Betty's response was to laugh. According to Ezekiel's later testimony, it wasn't the laugh of someone who had lost her mind. It was the laugh of someone who believed she held all the power. She told him that her family was protected by forces he couldn't understand. That Sarah's destiny was already written in blood and starlight, and that anyone who tried to interfere would face consequences that would echo through generations. What happened next depends on who you ask, but the facts carved into cemetery stones don't lie. On the night of November 15, 1909, a fire consumed Betty's cabin while she, Samuel, and 6-year-old Sarah slept inside. The official cause was listed as an overturned lantern, but the positioning of the bodies told a different story. They were found huddled together in the center of the main room, as if they had been waiting for something rather than trying to escape. Ezekiel's grandson, interviewed shortly before his death in 1987, claimed his grandfather had confessed the truth on his deathbed. The fire hadn't been an accident. The men of the Hollow had decided that some bloodlines were too corrupted to continue, that some secrets were too dangerous to survive. They had surrounded the cabin in the dead of night and set it ablaze, standing guard to ensure that no one escaped to spread their genetic poison to other communities. But here's where the story takes its final, most disturbing turn. When they were clearing the ruins 3 days later, they found something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had been Betty's bedroom, they discovered a wooden box containing dozens of carefully preserved samples. Hair, teeth, and other biological materials from every member of the bloodline going back 5 generations. Alongside these gruesome trophies was a detailed breeding chart that mapped out not just what had already happened, but what Betty had planned for the future. The chart showed Sarah's projected offspring, calculated with mathematical precision to produce what Betty called the ultimate convergence. But most chilling of all, it showed Betty's own name at the center of a web that connected her to every other member of the family in ways that suggested her relationship with Samuel had been just the beginning of a much larger, more systematic plan. The box and its contents were buried in an unmarked grave outside the Hollow's boundaries, and the men who buried it swore an oath never to speak of what they had seen. But secrets have a way of surviving even when the people who keep them don't. And somewhere in those West Virginia mountains, in a cemetery where the headstones still tell their twisted story, Betty's legacy continues to whisper its dark truths to anyone brave enough to listen. The bloodline ended that night in 1909, but the questions it raises about the depths of human depravity and the price of absolute isolation remain unanswered. Some boundaries once crossed can never truly be uncrossed.